Chapter 4. Money Makes the World Go Round. Candace's point of view,
Good morning.
Jacob said with a smile. Candace studied him for a moment.
Did you watch me sleep all night?
She asked.
And if I did?
She didn't know how to respond to that. She had never had a man watch her sleep before. At least not since childhood, when her parents and brothers would keep an eye on her as she slept.
What time is it?
She wondered aloud as she pulled herself out of bed. Jacob's point of view, Jacob smiled. He had noticed her cheeks flush when she thought about him sitting there all night, watching her sleep. Jacob groaned as he watched her climb out of bed. He could see every curve of her body through her nightgown, and if he were still alive, he would be so hard right now.
Candace,
He whispered. She turned to him. He grinned and said,
you look beautiful this morning.
That lovely blush pinkened her cheeks again. She gave him a faint smile before grabbing her bag and dashing into the bathroom. He chuckled as he placed his hands behind his head and leaned back against the headboard. A few minutes later, Candace emerged from the bathroom wearing a pair of jean shorts and a t-shirt. He watched her place her bag on the bed and then look at him.
What do you plan to do today?
She asked, studying his face. He shrugged and she rolled her eyes.
What do you normally do?
She asked.
Normally, I stay as far away from here as possible.
She eyed him for a moment and shrugged.
I would have thought you would be haunting this place.
He chuckled.
I've already tried that. It didn't do me much good. People seemed to enjoy it more, and I couldn't get them to leave.
She laughed.
So it was you who haunted the bed and breakfast when it first opened.
He shrugged and said,
I tried.
But why?
Wouldn't you if someone turned your family home into a bed and breakfast, and they treated your death as a joke?
Candace's point of view. Candace watched Jacob. He had a valid point. She wouldn't be happy if the Donaldson mansion were converted into a bed and breakfast. As for his death, there was the presumption that he had taken his own life. Very few people believed someone had killed him. Who could have killed him? His mother?
Why do you care about the house you abandoned so easily when you jumped off the balcony?
She asked. His eyes turned ice cold, causing her to take a step back. Not that he could physically harm her, but hadn't he made objects move when he haunted the bed and breakfast? For the first time, she noticed that his eyes were gray, and at that moment, they appeared as fierce as a tornado in a rainstorm.
I did not kill myself.
He growled. He jumped off the bed and stormed past her toward the double doors. Candace could sense his rage and sorrow. She stepped toward him, about to touch his back, but then remembered that he was a spirit and she couldn't touch him. With a sad sigh, she lowered her hand to her side and moved to stand beside him at the other door.
How did you die?
She asked softly. He took a deep breath and looked at her.
My stepbrother pushed me over the railing.
She gasped in shock and covered her mouth.
But why?
She inquired.
Money.
He muttered.
Money? You mean?
Jacob nodded.
He killed my father. The fireworks display blowing up on my father was no accident. Edward waited until the money and all his holdings were in my name, and then he killed me too. Then, once it was in my mother's name, he pushed her down the stairs. Do you know how frustrating it is not to be able to warn your mother that she's next?
Candace frowned.
I'm sorry.
Jacob sighed.
There is nothing we can do about it now.
Does your mother...
She started, then paused to find the right words. She couldn't think of anything but the simplest words, so she continued.
haunt the property too?
He shook his head.
She went into the light and begged me to go with her. But I wasn't ready to leave. I had other things on my mind.
Revenge.
She said. He nodded solemnly.
Among other things. But yes, that was at the top of my list. And believe me, I have tried to locate Edward and his father. I know they retired, but I haven't found where they are yet.
I can help.
She offered. Jacob's point of view. Jacob looked at Candace. She was being honest. She truly wanted to help him, and he found it difficult to refuse her offer, especially with her captivating eyes piercing into his very soul. If only he had met her while he was still alive.
How old are you?
He found himself asking her. She smiled.
26, a full 5 years older than you.
Jacob laughed.
Does that mean I have to respect you?
If you know what's good for you, you do.
He nodded.
Yes, ma'am. How did you know I'm 21?
She smiled.
Because I learned to add and subtract in school. Didn't they teach you anything?
He laughed and said,
Ah, touché.
he thought for a moment and gave her his sexy as sin grin.
Technically, I'm older than you.
He told her. She stared at him.
Where did you learn your math? A Cracker Jack box?
He burst into laughter. One side of her mouth lifted into a half smile, then the other side followed. He smiled as he reached his hand over to touch her cheek. His hand waved in the air beside her cheek. She sucked in a shocked breath at the sensation of his near touch. He smiled.
I was born in 1988. You were born in what, 1993?
She smiled.
But you're dead, forever 21. I will keep aging.
She stopped and frowned. Jacob longed to pull her into his arms and hold her close. Instead, he smiled and said,
Okay, you win.
She sighed and turned to him.
I didn't want to win.
He turned to watch her. Gone was the excitable young woman. Back was the moping and depressed.
Hey.
He said as he moved to the bed and jumped onto it. She turned and watched him. Jacob landed on the mattress and sank through to the floor. He watched Candace grin, but she didn't laugh.
Come sit here.
He invited, his head emerging just above the mattress. Jacob wagged his eyebrows at Candace, hoping to hear her sweet laughter. She laughed, which made him happy, and he smiled. He chuckled when she picked up a throw pillow from the chair and tossed it at him. They both laughed when it passed through his head. With a broad grin, he settled onto the bed and leaned against the headboard, his hands clasped behind his head.
Will you join me?
He asked with a mischievous grin.
You are a scoundrel.
She said, crossing her arms over her chest.
Were you like this when you were alive?
He contemplated for a moment.
Perhaps a little. But to be honest, I find that I behave differently around you. It's as if I can't help it.
Candace's point of view. Candace smiled as she approached the bed.
Breakfast time.
Anne-Marie announced as she barged into the room. Candace paused and looked from Jacob, still sitting on the bed, to her best friend, who stood at the open door, and then back again. Both of them wore bright smiles.
Candy?
Anne-Marie questioned. Candace smiled at Anne-Marie, which made her friend smile in return. Candace could tell that Anne-Marie was delighted to see her smiling again. If only she could share with her that the spirit of Jacob Postal had restored her smile. Anne-Marie's point of view. Anne-Marie continued to smile at her best friend. She was overjoyed to see her friend smiling again. She could have sworn she heard her friend laughing as she walked down the hall toward Candace's room. Although it was unusual to see Candace laughing alone in her room, if her friend was happy and smiling again, who was she to stop her?
Breakfast.
Anne-Marie said, still smiling.
Right.
Candace nodded and walked toward the door.
I'll see you later.
She murmured. Jacob's point of view. Jacob smiled, aware that Candace was speaking to him. He sighed and closed his eyes. Having someone to talk to after all this time was amazing. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed it. He opened his eyes when his body started to move on its own. He was still in a seated position, his legs extended in front of him as he floated over the railing and down to the ground floor.
This is definitely new.
He muttered. Candace's point of view. Candace looked up, her eyes widening when she saw Jacob floating across the room toward her.
What are you doing?
She hissed when he stopped beside her.
I thought you were staying in the room.
He grinned and laced his fingers behind his head again.
So did I, darling. But whatever it is that has bound us together seems to want me to stay with you.
But why?
She groaned.
What was that?
Grady asked, turning to Candace. Candace smiled at her brother.
Nothing. Just talking to myself. Figuring out what I want to do today.
I know what I want to do.
Jacob said, wagging his eyebrows.
You're incorrigible.
Candace hissed. Jacob grinned and said,
Nay, my queen.
Candace snorted. Grady and Anne-Marie, double point of view. Grady and Anne-Marie exchanged a concerned glance.
At least she's talking.
Anne-Marie whispered. Grady let out a deep sigh and nodded.
Oh my God.
Candace practically screamed. Anne-Marie and Grady asked what at the same time. Jacob's point of view.
What the hell?
Jacob said, jumping to his feet and scanning the room. What had his new friend nearly hyperventilating? Candace cried and jumped to her feet.
I can't stay here.
She said, panic in her voice.
Sit down.
Grady said, pulling Candace back into her seat.
What in the world has you so upset?
Behind you, the third table to the right.
Candace whispered, starting to tremble. Grady glanced over his right shoulder and Candace grunted.
My right, your left.
Grady and Anne-Marie looked behind them and to their left, their faces paling simultaneously.
The worm.
Grady snarled, jumping to his feet. Candace grasped her brother's arm.
Please, Grady, don't cause a scene.
She begged. Grady grumbled and leaned back in his seat. Anne-Marie was still looking at the table, her eyes wide.
Isn't that Veronica Pennelbrook with him?
Yes.
Candace hissed.
Who is he?
Jacob asked, observing the man and woman at the table in question.
Donald Sterling.
Candace mumbled in response.
Ah, the despicable groom.
Jacob said, his eyes squinting angrily at the other man. Candace's point of view. Candace didn't notice the expression on Jacob's face. Her head was down as she fiddled with her napkin.
What is he doing here?
Anne-Marie hissed.
And with her?
I told you he didn't love me. He only wanted the family money.
Candace mumbled. Anne-Marie scoffed.
Well, he had me fooled.
Not us.
Grady growled.
Brad, Howard, Andrew, and I knew from the start what he was after. That's why we told him that Candace wouldn't inherit anything until she turned 40.
Candace looked at her brother with wide eyes. Grady smiled a mischievous smile.
It's not true, of course, but he seemed to believe it.
That's why he stood me up at the altar.
Candace hissed. Grady's face paled.
I'm sorry you had to go through that, sis. But isn't it better to know before you married the jackass?
Candace screeched angrily as she threw her napkin onto the table and stood up.
I wish you and the others had, just for once, butted out of my life.
She exclaimed, then turned and stormed out of the room. Jacob's point of view. Jacob was torn between wanting to comfort Candace and wanting to learn more about her and the man she almost married. A wave of jealousy surged through him as he looked at Donald Sterling.
I should go talk to her.
Grady said as he stood up. Anne-Marie pulled him back into his seat and fixed him with a disapproving look.
That was the cruelest thing you and your brothers have ever done to your sister.
He stared at her, confused.
How? She avoided marrying that creep.
Anne-Marie growled with agitation.
Man, you're all alike.
But we prevented her from marrying that man by revealing that he was only interested in her money.
He protested on behalf of himself and his brothers. She grumbled under her breath, sighed, and turned to face him, her expression softening. Jacob smiled as he watched Anne-Marie. It was clear that she was deeply in love with this man.
Grady, darling.
She said sweetly,
You embarrassed and deeply hurt your sister. She was left at the altar, abandoned for the first time in her life. Consider how you would feel if I left you at the altar.
she added softly, holding his hand. Grady's point of view. Grady's face paled as he reflected on Anne-Marie's words. He gazed at her, then drew her close and kissed her.
Don't ever do that to me.
he said, closing his eyes and leaning his forehead against hers. Jacob's point of view. Jacob's eyebrows furrowed when Anne-Marie started laughing. Then he understood her reaction from her following words.
You would have to ask me to marry you first.
Grady smiled and kissed her again. She sighed with contentment as she kissed him back. Jacob learned a few things from them, but not enough to understand everything. He looked over at Donald Sterling and Veronica Pentelbrook. He recognized the name Pentelbrook. It's linked to old money, much like his surname. But who were Candace and her brothers? From what he had gathered, she had 4 brothers, including Grady. Candace appeared to be the youngest and the only girl.